So an upgrade to the i2 camera has just been released. There's a new firmware by Polaroid. It's taken them a long time to fix an obvious problem that everybody talked about, was that the metering system of the camera was inaccurate. So according to everything that I've read, the firmware fixes that. So what we're gonna do today is we're gonna quickly load up some fresh, brand new Polaroid film in the camera. I'm still running an old firmware right now, and I'm gonna take 3 pictures. I'm gonna do a portrait, a landscape, and a close-up with the old firmware. I'm gonna walk you through how to do the upgrade of the firmware, and then we're gonna shoot the exact same 3 pictures again, so we have a side-by-side, and we can verify, is it truly a meaningful fix for the camera? So let's get shooting. Let's take the first shots. All right, so I'm gonna put the camera on automatic mode. So it's set to auto. I have the exposure compensation dial back to neutral, and I'm gonna take a picture of this just boring generic landscape right here. Frame number 1. Frame number 2 is going to be this. Lots of nice texture. We'll do a close-up of it. And frame number 3 is a portrait. Here we go, honey. And last, I'm going to take one more landscape, because I realized that the first landscape that I took is definitely very backlit, so it's a very challenging landscape. I thought I'd come around the yard over here. And take this equally sort of boring landscape, but it has a great blue sky with the tree, so it'll be at least interesting. And we have a rabbit.
Aw.
Okay, last shot. Oh, I think this worked out. Okay, so what we're gonna do now is I'm going to upgrade the i2 to the most current firmware. So I'm running an iPhone 15 Pro Max. I've got the Bluetooth connecting the camera to my phone. So why don't you come over here, Eve? And it's quite simple. All you have to do is the camera sees my phone. You tap Firmware Upgrade, Start Firmware Upgrade. As you can see, the camera now is at 14%, transferring the information down to the i2. And on the i2, it says Firmware Update on the LED screen right here. So now we have, as you can see, update successful on the app. I hit done, we're good to go. And I'm going to turn the camera back on. We're gonna go outside and now take the same photographs again and see if the new firmware upgrade is as good as I hope it will be. Frame number 1. 2. One thing I noticed too, as my camera's aging, you know, really always double check that the exposure compensation is back at 0. Need to have you come down now for the portrait, Steve. Okay, step over just a little bit this way. The camera's down just a hair. Oh, this way just a hair. Right there. Now we'll take the last landscape back here. With our bunny rabbit still in it.
Aw, bunny's gone.
All right, we'll go inside and see how they look. All right, so let's take a look at the images. Now, on the right side will always be the old firmware, and on the left side is the new firmware. And right off the bat, you can see a big difference here. The old firmware, as we know, always overexposed an image. And as a result, you can see the shadows are a little more open, but the highlights are also a little too bright. On the new firmware, it's a little darker, yet still full shadow detail, and the highlights are well controlled. I would say that either one of these two are very usable. However, I'll give it to the new firmware as being just slightly better. Let's take a look at another image. Now on this image, there's the old firmware, here's the new firmware. There's a combination of things going on. First off, you can see I'm a little closer on the image on the old firmware than I am on the new, obviously. And there's a little bit of motion in this, a little bit of a blur from camera movement. And some of that is I find that when the camera's in auto mode, it a lot of times will try to default to something like 16 or 22, even if you're at a f16 or f22, even if you're at a shutter speed of like a 30th of a second or a 45th of a second. I never use auto mode in this camera, but that is something I noticed, and I will talk about it more in my conclusion. But if you just look at the exposure between the two, obviously the new one definitely has a better exposure. The firmware definitely helped in that case. Now, if we look at the portrait of Eve, here's the old firmware, here's the new firmware. Once again, I see a huge difference. You know, her sweater's a little too bright right here. Her forehead's a little too bright. This is a much better representation with the new firmware. It's subtle, it's 2/3 of a stop, but it definitely makes a difference. And now we'll look at the final test image. Here is the old firmware. Here is the new firmware. Now, obviously the light had changed a little bit because it took time to go inside and film other parts of the video. So in this case, I really can't quantify exactly, but I would say that the new firmware, based upon all the other images, seems to just be more accurate in terms of its overall exposure. But again, it's a subtle improvement. It's not a radical improvement. Okay, so the firmware upgrade for the i2 is quite good, and it does solve the problem with the metering. However, I don't like using this camera in auto mode. I never really have. And what I found today when I was using the auto mode is that the camera, and it might also be part of the new firmware, likes to default to f-stops like 16, 22, 32, even when it's giving you shutter speeds like a 30th of a second or a 45th of a second. To me, that's a problem, of course, because you're going to be introducing potential of camera shake. So I always use this camera in aperture priority mode. And when I did a few test images like that, they were spot on, the meter was really good, and I could make sure that I had a shutter speed more appropriate, something like a 60th or a 125th, where I wouldn't have camera shake and I would still have adequate depth of field. Thank you very much for listening. I can't wait to hear your thoughts. Now go shoot some film.